When sweet meant rare, you settle beneath your covers, the room quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock. Outside, the world sleeps, and here, your mind begins a soft journey back to a time when sweetness was not a given, not a habit, not a constant presence in every drink, every bite, every celebration. No, there was a time when to taste something sweet was to taste a moment of wonder. It was rare. It was treasured. And it was remembered. In the centuries before granulated sugar filled glass jars on kitchen shelves, before chocolate bars lined market stalls and candies were doled out with casual delight, people lived in a world where sweetness was fleeting. It was earned. It was hunted, gathered, saved, and sometimes fought over not with swords, but with effort and patience. Imagine waking up in a small wooden home, stone floor cold beneath bare feet, fire crackling low in the hearth. A woman, perhaps your mother, perhaps your is early. The day, like most days, breakfast is warm, grain porridge, thick and plain. There's no brown sugar to stir in, no syrup to drizzle, no sweet jam or honey waiting in a neat ceramic pot. Unless, of course, the bees had been generous last season and someone in your village had braved the wild hive. Even fruit, ripe and fragrant, is precious. It comes in waves, berries in spring, apples in fall. But once they're gone, they're gone. There's no refrigeration, no freezer bag to reach for. So people dry them, mash them into pastes, boil them down. All to save a trace of that sweetness for the months when winter wraps its quiet arms around the land. For most, sweetness is not something you taste every day. It's a flavor saved for feast days and festivals, weddings and harvest celebrations, sometimes even funerals. That's how rare it is, so sacred. Sweetness is the taste of memory, of meaning. In ancient Egypt, a drop of honey on the tongue of a baby was a blessing. In Rome, preserved figs were placed gently on platters for honored guests. In medieval villages, when a boy turned 10, a small tart with stewed plums might be the greatest treat he'd know all year. Sweetness could also mean effort. You might climb a tree for it, risk a sting, dry your hands cracking nuts for it, or watch over a simmering pot for hours just to coax a little syrup from something that didn't want to give it freely. It was not only food. Sweet was a word for behavior, for gesture, for memory. To be sweet was to be kind, to offer something gentle in a hard world. And when someone gave you the last slice of honey cake or the most ripened peach, you knew what that meant. But not all sweetness was gentle. Sometimes it was the one thing a family had to trade. A jar of dark molasses could buy you a week of bread. A handful of candied seeds might win your daughter a pair of shoes. And so, sweetness also carried weight. It had power, value. Perhaps that's why, in so many old tales, sweetness is used as a trap, a trail of candy to lure the manwari, a promise of honeyed words before betrayal. When something is rare, it becomes valuable. And when something is valuable, it is often dangerous too. But for now, in this soft place between wakefulness and sleep, we simply remember, sweetness, once upon a time, was a reward for patience, a gift from the earth, coaxed gently by human hands, stored in clay pots and shared with care. And maybe that's what made it sweeter. The gift of the bees lets walk slowly now, deeper into the past. The air smells of pine and earth. The light is softer here, filtered through thick tree canopies. Beneath the branches, a figure moves carefully, eyes scanning the bark and branches. She carries smoke in a woven basket, damp leaves and moss smouldering inside, and her footsteps are quiet, deliberate. She is searching for something precious, a hive. Before honey was bought in glass jars with tidy labels, it had to be found. Wild hive-shine trees, hidden in crevices of rocky cliffs, tucked into the eaves of old structures and nature's treasure chests. Bees, humming like living threads of gold, created their shimmering stores in secret. And people, from the earliest times, learned how to read the woods to find them. It was not easy. You needed to understand bees, their flight, their season, their favorite flowers. A child might learn from her grandmother to follow the pattern, show bees fly low when returning heavy with nectar, how the air near a hive holds a particular rhythm, like a musical note you feel more than hear. Smoke was essential. Not to harm the bees, but to speak to them. The smoke calmed them, confused them slightly, coaxing them into stillness. Without it, even the bravest forager risked a dozen stings or more. So the seeker of sweetness would carry a small burning bundle, waving it gently near the hive, whispering words to no one in particular. Climbing was often involved. Sometimes a ladder, but more often just hands and feet on rough bark. The hive might be many feet above the ground, or hidden in a narrow space, requiring a slim arm and trust in luck. And always, the goal was the same, not just the honey, but the wax, the comb, the sweetness hidden in the golden maze. Once home, the process continued slowly. The combs were pressed between flat stones or hung to drip in clay bowls. The liquid gold would ooze gently, carrying with it the scent of the forest, the flowers, even the bees themselves. Nothing was wasted. The wax could be shaped into candles, the comb chewed for its taste, the honey stirred into porridge or spread on bread on special days. In many cultures, honey was considered sacred, a gift not just from bees, but from the gods. The Greeks offered it to the dead. The Celts called it the drink of immortality. In India, it was one of the 5 elixirs of life. Even today, in the quiet corners of old Europe, you might find tiny wax figurines left at shrine as sweet offerings for luck, love, or healing. But for most ordinary women, living in medieval cottages or Roman towns or Viking outposts, honey was above all a treasure. A spoonful might calm a child's cough. A drop might sweeten a tart drink. A small jar might be tucked away, only brought out for weddings, births, or winter solstice nights. And the bee. They were watched with reverence. Not pets, not pests, but workers of quiet magic. Families might keep simple hives made of strawcool, skeps or wooden boxes if they were lucky. Children were taught to leave offerings for the bees when someone died. To tell them the news. To never swat, never disturb. Because in a world without sugar, bees were not just insects, they were alchemists, turning sunlit nectar into joy, into medicine, into memory. So now, as you drift further into calm, imagine that gift in your hands, a small clay pot, sealed with wax, holding just a few ounces of honey. It smells faintly of summer fields. It gleams even in dim candlelight. And you quiet, warm, content know that inside is more than sweetness. It is the story of effort, of risk, of reverence, and of reward. Fruit on the brink, you are standing in a garden, now an ancient one. The air is heavy with the scent of late summer, overripe pears, sun-warmed figs, and grapes hanging thick and low on the vine. The light has shifted. It is not the pale green of spring or the hard gold of midsummer. It is deeper now, tinged with amber, as if the world itself is ripening. In the time before sugar, fruit was the most immediate and sometimes the only source of sweetness available to ordinary people. But even fruit, in all its abundance, had rules. It came in seasons, often fleeting. Strawberries might last 2 weeks, apricots even less. A bad storm, a swarm of birds, or an early frost could ruin an entire harvest. So when the fruit came, people gathered, and gathered fast. Children climbed trees. Women crouched in orchards with wide cloths stretched between them. The work was joyful, but urgent, and always there was this same lingering question: how can we make this sweetness last? The answer, most often, was drying. Long before electric dehydrators and tidy vacuum packs, people learned to preserve fruit using nothing but sun, smoke, patience, and time. It was a ritual. Apples were sliced into rings and strung on cords near the hearth. Grapes were laid on woven mats in sunlit courtyards. Figs were split and turned inside out, their sugars caramelizing gently in the warmth. In colder climates or during rainy seasons, drying moved indoors, into attics, where heat rose and air stayed dry, into smokehouses, where soft plumes infused prunes and pears with a savory edge. Some fruit was mashed into thick pastes and smeared onto flat stones or cloth to become an early version of what you might call fruit leather. There was no added sugar, of course. No glaze or coating. The sweetness came only from the fruit itself, concentrated, deepened by time. It was the kind of sweetness that clung to your tongue slowly, not like candy, but like a memory. Then there was the art of fermentation. Left too long, some fruit began to turn, but not all spoilage was a loss. Apples could become cider, grapes became wine, and in the in-between stage soft, slightly fizzy preserves, gentle with natural sugar families discovered new ways to sweeten dull meals. A dollop of fermented plum alongside hard cheese. A spoonful of soft raisins in a bowl of coarse grain. Even the peel was not wasted. Citrus peel might be boiled and dried. Pomegranate rind stored for steeping. Everything was used. Every sweet scrap was cherished. Imagine now an old woman in a thick wool shawl, seated beside a window as autumn wind rattles the shutters. In her hands, a single fig wrapped in linen. She unwraps it slowly, reverently. It is dry, but not brittle. It has been waiting for this moment since the heat of July. She bites into it. Her eyes close, and for a heartbeat, the warmth of summer rushes back through her. For those who live by the rhythms of the land, sweetness was never constant but always remembered. A pear ripened to near collapse. A cluster of raisins clinging to their stems. The tart edge of a dried cherry softened in warm porridge. Each one carried the memory of a season, a harvest, a sun that once shone and now slept beneath the snow. Even children learned to treasure them. A single dried plum tucked into a lunch bundle. A strip of pressed apple shared between sisters. In lean times, those small, sweet things held hope. And now, as you breathe a little slower, your mind softening like overripe fruit, you can imagine that garden again. Not perfect. Not endless. But filled with just enough sweetness to carry the soul from one season to the next. Now the journey takes us from orchard to hearth, from the whispering leaves of fig trees to the steady bubbling of pots on ancient stoves. Here, inside kitchens of clay and stone, we meet another kind of sweetness uncoaxed from fruit and stalk, through fire, time, and a careful hand. This was not sweetness plucked from a branch, but one transformed by labor. In the ancient world, where sugar crystals were unknown or unreachable to most, people discovered that boiling down certain juices created thick, rich syrup, sometimes bitter, sometimes smoky, always concentrated. These were the molasses and reductions of the old world. Not exactly what we think of today, but distant cousins, bearing the same golden brown hues and sticky weight. Grapes were among the first to offer such nectar. In places like Mesopotamia, Greece and the Roman world, grape must the crushed juice of the entire fruit was simmered gently for hours in wide, shallow bronze cauldrons. As the water evaporated, what remained was a dark, luscious syrup called defrutum, or sepa. The longer it boiled, the thicker and sweeter it became. This syrup was used to sweeten everything from barley porridge to stewed meat. It could be stirred into wine, brushed on bread, or even mixed with herbs for medicine. Soldiers carried it in small flasks. Children licked it from their fingers, and women used it to disguise the bitterness of foraged greens or wild grains during lean seasons. In warmer regions, especially across North Africa and the Near East, dates played a similar role. When crushed and pressed, these soft fruits released a thick, amber liquid. Sometimes it was strained and boiled into a syrup so sweet it felt like sun in a spoon. This was dibs, and it became a staple of both cooking and ritual. Date syrup was stirred into milk, added to flatbreads, and poured over roasted grains. Its richness felt almost sinful to those who seldom tasted sugar. But it was also deeply practical, long-lasting, easy to store, and nourishing. In other places, sugarcane was known but not in crystal form. It was chewed raw, crushed and boiled into a deep molasses, especially in parts of Asia and later the Mediterranean. This version was darker, more bitter, but still sweet enough to be treasured. The process was never easy. It required watching, tending, knowing exactly when to pull the pot from the flame. Too short, and the syrup would spoil. Too long, and it burned. The women who mastered this work passed down their knowledge like a quiet Artho to test a drop on a cold plate, how to judge readiness by scent alone. Children would gather around, drawn by the smell. Not every household could afford to waste fruit on syrup, so when it happened, it was an event, a treat. a promise of celebration ahead. Imagine now a scene in an old stone cottage. A woman in a soot-darkened apron stirs a pot slowly, her hand wrapped in cloth against the rising steam. Her daughter watches, wide-eyed, holding a wooden spoon. In the air floats a scent like caramel and smoke and late summer. She dips the spoon. Blows. Tastes. The eyes. This is sweetness born of patience. Unlike fresh fruit, syrup could be stored, poured into ceramic jars, sealed with wax, hidden away for winter or saved for a holy day. A spoonful in tea, a drizzle on bread, it could change the tone of a whole meal. It also became part of storytelling. Recipes were shared in whispers. Each household had its own way, boiling longer, adding a sprig of rosemary, crushing walnuts into the mix. Sweetness became personal. And now, as your thoughts soften and the outside world fades, you can feel that warmth too, the firelit room, the weight of the wooden spoon, the scent of something deep and old, sweetened not just by ingredients, but by memory, by tradition, by love. Let's go further now, not into orchards or kitchens, but into forests, into places where sweetness hides deep within bark, beneath the soil, or dripping slowly from wounded trees. Before sugar, before candies and cakes, even before fruit was easy to preserve, people turned to the woods. There, they discovered that sweetness could be drawn not just from fruit or honey, but from the veins of the earth itself. One of the oldest sweeteners known to humankind is licorice root. Long before it flavored lozenges or black confections in neat packages, licorice was dug from the ground by hand. Its roots, long and thin, held a natural compound many times sweeter than sugar. In ancient China, in Egypt, and across Europe, it was used to soothe throats, calm coughs, and add a faint, lingering sweetness to infusions and pastes. Children were sometimes given a cleaned root to chew a treat that could last hours. Soft at first, then woody, it released its taste slowly, like a hidden promise. In places where fruit was rare or honey expensive, a root in the hand was still a form of joy. Sap, too, was a treasured gift. In the cold forests of North America, indigenous peoples tapped maple trees in late winter, gathering the clear liquid and boiling it over open fires until it thickened into a syrup unlike any other. Golden, smoky, rich. Early European settlers learned from them, carrying forward the knowledge with awe. The sap was another sourceless sweet, but nourishing and refreshing. In parts of Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, it was collected in spring and sometimes allowed to ferment lightly, creating a sweet tonic. Then there were trees, whose bark itself could be infused. Cassia and cinnamon, for instance, added a warm, spicy sweetness when steeped in warm milk or wine. These weren't used daily. Of course, most people never saw them, but even a small shaving passed through trade routes was a treasure. Often locked away. Sometimes used only during births, weddings, or holy feasts. Other barks, like slippery elm or sassafras, were ground and added to broths or drinks, offering not only flavor but comfort. These were sweeteners that carried healing, both real and imagined. A spoonful from a steaming pot, flavored faintly with sap or root, was a balm for both the sick and the weary. Imagine an old cottage at the edge of a forest. A woman crouches near the base of a tree, her hands dirtied from digging. She holds a bundle of roots, tied with twine, and beside her, a pot simmers on the coals. She adds a piece of bark, stirs gently, and leans close. The scent that rises is sharp, sweet, earthy. She closes her eyes. She knows the forest has shared something with her again. Not all sweeteners were obvious. Some came from labor days of boiling, drying, and grinding. Others came from listening to the land, to stories, to ancestors who knew which plant to choose, which time of year to harvest, which bark to dry in the shade and which to roast lightly for full flavor. And because these kinds of sweetness took so much effort, they were never taken for granted. A sip of sap-infused broth was warming not only to the body, but to the soul. It said, someone tended this. Someone remembered. Someone passed this knowledge down. As you breathe in now, let your thoughts imagine the scent of roots drying in the sun, of steam curling from a wooden bowl. There is sweetness in the soil, if you know where to look. And in times before sugar, that knowledge was one of the quiet arts of survival. Let us wander now into a garden not for fruit, but for fragrance. a place where the sweetness is not in juice or pulp, but in petals thin, trembling, and filled with scent. In the days before sugar, people found sweetness not only in what they could bite or chew, but in what they could infuse. And so, they turned to flowers. Roses, above all, were prized. Their petals, especially from old varieties Damas and Gallica, held a soft, syrupy aroma that lingered long after the bloom had faded. People learned to distill these petals into rose water. With careful hands, they steeped them in warm water or oil, sometimes pressing them with stones or soaking them overnight before filtering the results through cloth. The result was a gentle, fragrant liquid, not sugary in the modern sense, but sweet in a way that clung to memory. A spoonful of rose water could turn a bowl of plain grain into something tender and festive. A drizzle over dried figs, a few drops in milk, and even the simplest dish became a little celebration. Lavender, too, was beloved. Especially in Western Europe, where it grew wild on sunny slopes and in rocky gardens. It was dried in bunches and hung from kitchen beams, not just for scent, but for cooking. The buds were sometimes added to honey or wine, steeped in vinegar, or used in slow bakes. Its sweetness was always gentle, never sharp, but it softened bitterness and added lightness to heavy stews or coarse breads. Orange blossoms, particularly in Moorish Spain and the Ottoman world, were used much the same way. Orange flower water made its way into pastries, drinks, even ceremonial rinses. Just a drop could evoke warm air, ripe fruit, and open courtyards humming with bees. In medieval England and France, violets were gathered in the spring. Crystallized in honey or dried into powders, they were considered elegant and refined. A few might be sprinkled over a tart, or pressed into cakes served at weddings and feasts. To taste one was to taste a season, brief, delicate, and full of meaning. Even less ornate blooms had their place. Elderflowers were steeped into cordials. Chamomile sweetened weak teas. Calendula added a whisper of warmth to broths and custards. Dandelions, though humble, were used in syrups and wine, their bitterness tamed by careful hands. But beyond the table, flower sweetness extended into other parts of life. Petals were strewn on floors during festivals. Scented waters were dabbed on skin. And always, there was that sense of celebration of beauty made edible. Children were taught not to pick carelessly. They learned which flowers were safe, which needed soaking, which could be used raw. In quiet corners, older women kept small books handwritten of recipes and remedies: rose jam for sore hearts, lavender water for sleep, elderflower syrup for fever. These weren't just flavors. They were care. Imagine now an old stone kitchen with wooden shutters cracked open to the breeze. On the table, a bowl of warm milk with a single drop of rose water swirling at the surface. A young girl stirs it with a carved spoon while her mother folds linen in the corner. The scent of petals rises faintly in the air, soft, familiar, comforting. In a world without sugar, sweetness was not just taste, it was feeling. Flowers taught people that sweetness could be a scent remembered, a color tasted, a ritual passed from hand to hand. As you breathe now, slower and deeper, you may sense the petals around you not as perfume, but as presence. The sweetness of a garden remembered in silence. A story whispered in bloom. Now we step inside another kind of hearth, one that smells not of honey or flowers, but of warm grain and soft steam. In homes across the ancient and medieval world, sweetness sometimes came not from fruit or syrup, but from grains themselves, coaxed patiently, transformed by time. Before sugar, even wheat and barley had their moments of sweetness. Not obvious, not instant. But if you knew how to wait, if you knew the signs, you could draw forth flavors subtle and satisfying. One of the earliest methods was malting. Grains like barley were soaked in water until they sprouted, then dried slowly by fire or sun. This process unlocked enzymes within the seed, breaking down starches into sugars. The result? A gentle, natural sweetness, not enough to overwhelm the tongue, but enough to bring depth to breads, stews, and early forms of porridge. In many places, these malted grains were ground into flour and used to make sweet cakes, beer, or warming broths. In some kitchens, a thick drink would be made by boiling the malted grain with herbs or honey. It filled the belly. It warmed the bones, and it left a trace of sweetness that stayed long after the bowl was empty. In East Asia, rice was treated similarly. Left to ferment lightly with the help of natural molds, It became a mosaic. Sweet rice porridge was boiled down to make a syrupy base for desserts. This fermentation unlocked sugars that the uncooked rice alone could not offer. It was warmth turned sweet. Sometimes wheat was roasted until it browned, then boiled and mashed. In Italy, a dish called panforte evolved with dried fruit, nuts, and sometimes sweetened grain paste. In ancient India, roasted gram flour was mixed with honey and ghee to form quick energy balls for travelers and laborers. In the cold seasons, especially, grains became comfort. A thick oat porridge, gently cooked with milk, stirred slowly until the natural sweetness bloomed. No sugar. No spice. Just the careful unfolding of flavor. And people enhanced it, where they could, a pinch of salt to sharpen the tongue. A drop of herbal syrup. A spoon of mashed fruit from a summer jar. But at its core, the sweetness was in the grain itself if treated with time and care. Families passed down ways to enhance this quiet sweetness. Stir counterclockwise. Use the first water, drawn at dawn. Let the pot rest after boiling. These weren't just culinary habits, they were stories, beliefs, the woven fabric of daily life. In some homes, grain pastes were shaped into small dumplings for feast days. In others, sprouted barley was flattened and dried for storage, then boiled on special occasions. Even when there was little to eat, there was always the knowledge that something soft and sweet could be made from what the land gave. Picture now a morning in a one-room cottage. Outside, snow drifts along the edges of a stone wall. Inside, a woman stirs a pot slowly. Steam rises in ribbons. Her son sits near the fire, waiting quietly, watching. She lifts a spoon, tastes, nods. The grain has bloomed. It's ready. She ladles it into a wooden bowl, and perhaps she adds just a pinch of dried plum from the jar nearby. But even without it, the warmth is sweet enough. Familiar. Nourishing. A moment of softness in a hard season. Grain was often humble. But when treated right, it offered a kind of sweetness deeper than sugar, a sweetness of labor, of waiting, of comfort. So now, let yourself rest in that warmth. Imagine the weight of the bowl in your hands, the gentle sweetness rising with each breath. And know that for many, long before sugar, this was enough. More than enough. There is a flickering candle now, and the hush of a still room. A woman kneels beside a pallet where a child lies sleeping, feverish and restless. In her hand is a spoon, and in the spoon a drop of honey. Not as food this time, but as medicine. Long before sugar-coated pills and syrups in tidy glass bottles, honey was the healer's ally. It was sweet, yes, but it was more than that. It soothed the throat, sealed wounds, calmed the stomach, and brightened the spirit. In a world of bitter teas and rough remedies, honey was the rare balm that comforted as it cured. In ancient Egypt, honey was used in over 500 medicinal recipes. It was mixed with crushed herbs, layered into poultices, and spread gently over burns. It wasn't just superstition. Honey is naturally antibacterial. Without knowing the science, healers knew the result. Cuts healed faster. Infections faded. Pain lessened. In Greece, Hippocrates wrote of honey's healing powers. He prescribed it for ulcers, coughs, and even melancholy. Roman soldiers carried it into battle both as a wound dressing and an energy source. In medieval monasteries, monks kept bees not just for candles or cakes, but for their infirmaries. Honey was stored beside dried yarrow, sage, and willow bark. But honey wasn't only a physical remedy. It drifted between the world of science and spirit. It was used in charms and blessings, in rituals meant to soothe not just the body, but the heart. In many cultures, honey was offered to the gods, poured onto altars, married with the dead. Babies might receive a dab of it on the tongue as their first taste of the world. Brides and grooms were given honeyed cakes to bless their union, hence this honeymoon, a time once marked by drinking mead each night for a full moon cycle. Honey was thought to draw good dreams, to invite fertility, to ward off evil. It was used in love spells and lullabies. It was brushed onto doors, smeared on cradles, whispered over in prayer. Even in darkness, honey played a role. When someone passed away, it was common in parts of Europe to tell the bees. The beekeeper would whisper to the hives, informing them of the death, sometimes even tying black ribbons around the skeps. If the bees were not told, it was feared they might abandon the hive or stop producing honey. Such was their bond with the family, their connection to the spirit world. And in lean times, when other remedies failed, honey could still offer hope. A drop on the tongue of a child too weak to eat. A smear across a chapped lip. A spoonful stirred into warm milk to help the grieving sleep. Its sweetness was not cloying, not overwhelming. It was round and deep, shaped by wild flowers, by wind, by season. And every jar held a different story of bees, of bloom, of the hands that gathered it. Imagine now a quiet shelf in a cool stone room. Jars of honey thick, golden, dark as amber. Some sealed with wax, others bound in cloth. Each one waiting for its moment. To heal. To bless. To comfort. And in that stillness, as you breathe and drift, you can feel the hum of ancient hives, the warmth of a spoon on your lip, the kind of sweetness that comes not in sugar, but in care, in ritual, in memory, in the soft magic of honey. The scent of baking fills the room, now not sugary, not like modern cakes or candy, but warm, grainy, spiced, a sweetness that is quiet, earthy, honest. You're in a kitchen from another time, where flour is ground by hand, where ovens are brick and breath, and where sweet bakes must be created without a single grain of refined sugar. So, how did they do it? Before sugar, baking was not about indulgency, it was about cleverness, about pulling sweetness from what was available, dried fruits, nuts, syrups, grains, and sometimes even vegetables. A sweet dish might mean a pie of apples softened with wine, or a cake made of mashed carrots and ground almonds. In medieval Europe, cooks used what they had. Honey, when affordable, was used sparingly, drizzled into batter or brushed on crusts. But more often, sweetening came from nature's storehouse. Dates chopped into paste, figs mashed and simmered, pears stewed until they nearly melted. These fruits brought not only flavor, but moisture, texture, even color. Spices added the illusion of sweetness. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, these were precious, yes, but also transformative. Even a small pinch could elevate a simple loaf of bread into something festive. Paired with raisins or apple slices, such breads became the centerpiece of feast days. In some traditions, barley malt was used to sweeten dough. It came from sprouted grain, dried and ground into powder. It didn't taste like sugar, but it mellowed the edge of sour breads and gave crusts a warm, caramel hint. There were cakes, though they didn't rise much. Flat, dense, rich with dried fruit and herbs. Some were steamed rather than baked, others cooked on stones or in ashes. A slice might be eaten slowly, savoured with warm ale or spiced milk, shared between friends or passed reverently to a guest. And then there were tarts. Before sugar, tarts were often savoury sweet. Onion and fig. Cheese and pear. A combination of richness and fruit, wrapped in duff, brushed with oil or honey. These were not desserts in the modern sense, but complex, layered dishes meant to both nourish and delight. In monasteries, bakers perfected recipes passed from scribe to scribe. Almond milk was used to soften grains. Dried cherries stirred into barley cakes. Even petals rose, violet, elderflower found their way into sweet breads, adding colour and fragrance more than flavour. Children in villages might gather fallen fruit, bruise, but still usable, to bring home to mothers and grandmothers. A few shriveled plums, some crabapples. Whatever was found was turned into something: jam, paste, filling. A pie need not be perfect to be loved. And in noble courts, more elaborate creations appeared, gingerbreads made of honey and breadcrumbs, sculpted into shapes of animals or castles, marzipan ground almonds and honey rolled into flowers. Confections made not to eat quickly, but to admire, to celebrate. Imagine now the sound of dough being kneaded, slowly, rhythmically. The crackle of a wood-burning oven. A woman lifting a small round loaf from the hearth, tapping its bottom to hear the hollow thud of doneness. She slices it and lays it on a plate. It's dense, fragrant. Inside, chopped apple, golden raisins, a hint of cinnamon. It's not overly sweet. But it's enough. Because in a world without sugar, baking wasn't about overwhelming the tongue, it was about balance, about season, about gratitude. A sweet bake was not ordinary. It was earned. So let yourself rest, now in that kitchen. Let the scent surround you, the quiet sweetness of grain and fruit and spice. A warmth that lives in memory, more than recipe. And know that, for centuries, people found sweetness not in excess but in creativity, in care, in the beauty of making something good with what little you had. The fire burns low now, and the season has changed again. Outside, the trees are bare. The chill wind presses against the shutters, and inside, women gather in the fading light, hands busy, minds focused. This is not a time of harvest, it is a time of keeping, preserving, saving what is sweet before time steals it away. In the days before refrigeration, preserving sweetness was both a skill and a quiet defiance against winter. It meant extending the memory of summer into the coldest months, when fruit trees stood silent and the bees had long returned to their hives. One of the oldest methods was to use honey itself. Fruits, especially figs, plums and slices of apple, could be gently boiled, then packed into jars and covered with honey. The natural sugars acted as a sealant, preventing spoilage and infusing the fruit with even more depth. These jars were stored in cellars or tucked into pantries, brought out only on the most special days. Another technique was drying and layering. Pears were sliced thin, dried on linen by the fire, then stacked into earthenware pots between leaves or herbs. Sometimes a thin layer of beeswax was poured on top, sealing the pot like a lid. The flavor deepened over time, no longer fresh, but something darker, more mysterious, like a memory fading but never quite lost. Jam, as we know it, didn't truly exist yet. But people made pastes. They mashed ripe fruit with warm wine or vinegar, sometimes adding chopped nuts or seeds. The mixture was cooked slowly over the fire, then spread onto clean stones or cloth to dry. These sheets were rolled up and stored sliced like candy, if you were lucky enough to find some. In the Middle East, fruit was often boiled down into thick, sticky molasses, pomegranate, grape or date. These syrups were poured into glazed jars, sealed with oil and cloth and hidden from sunlight. A spoonful stirred into grain porridge or warm milk brought life back to otherwise dull meals. In some places, root cellars were used. Fruits were packed in straw or sand, kept cool and dry through the cold months. Apples, quinces, and even grapes could last weeks or more if tended carefully. Each morning, someone would check the baskets, turning the fruit gently, removing any that had softened too soon. This was care as daily ritual. Salt played a role, too less for flavor, more for safety. In northern climates, some berries were packed into brine or vinegar, creating a strange blend of sweet and sharp. It was a dessert, not exactly, but it offered contrast, a new way of thinking about what sweet could mean. Even butter was flavored. In some old kitchens, soft cheese or churned butter would be mixed with honey and herbs, then sealed in clay jars. These were treats for feast days, spread on coarse bread or offered to a weary traveller. And then there were the secret jars. Every household had them, for one pot no child could open without permission. Hidden under a loose floorboard, behind a shelf, or inside a barrel. It held preserved apricots, or a bit of plum paste, or dried cherries soaked in mead. Just enough for midwinter. Just enough to remember that sweetness still existed. Picture now a grandmother in a quiet kitchen. She empties a cloth lid, leans close to inhale the scent of fruit steeped in time. She dips a spoon just once and places a small bite onto a crust of bread. Across from her, a child waits, wide-eyed. The taste is sweet, and it tells a story without words, because preserving sweetness was more than food. It was resistance. Oh. A promise carried forward, bite by bite, through the bitter months. As you breathe now, slowly and deeply, let yourself feel the warmth of that cellar, the hum of memory in each preserved jar. In the quiet work of saving sweetness, there was love. There was a legacy. There was light. The sky outside is grey, But inside, the table is warm and full. Neighbors gather, aprons dusted with flour, hands sticky with dough or fruit. Someone is laughing. The kettle whistles. And at the heart of it all, there is something sweet, small, simple, maybe just a slice or spoonful, but shared. Because in the world before sugar, sweetness wasn't just flavor. It was connection. Throughout history, sweet foods were rarely eaten alone. They were part of moments, of gatherings, of traditions stitched together by time. To share something sweet was to share a piece of joy, no matter how modest. A plum tart at a wedding, a honey biscuit for a new mother, a raisin-studded loaf when a son came home from sea. In village life, preparing a sweet dish often took many hands. Dried fruit had to be soaked, nuts shelled, grains ground, herbs picked at just the right time. It was work, yes, but work done together. And as people peeled, stirred, and waited for the fire to burn just hot enough, they talked. They told stories. They passed recipes down without writing them. In many cultures, sweetness marked beginnings. A first birthday, a new house, a harvest safely gathered. Even small children learned that the arrival of something sweet meant something special had happened or was about to. Sweetness could also be a peace offering. Neighbors might bring a honey cake to mend an argument. A visiting priest could be greeted with dried figs and wine. A weary traveller offered a spoonful of fruit preserve as both comfort and hospitality. In noble households, the social meaning of sweetness was even more elaborate. Feasts often ended with sugar sculptures, marzipan animals, or spiced pastries shaped like castles. These weren't just desserts, they were performances, a display of wealth and welcome. Supi, offered the final course, was a gesture of honor. But in humble homes, sweetness was quieter yet just as meaningful. A bowl of barley porridge with a few dried berries, a flatbread brushed with honey, a tart made from foraged apples. What mattered wasn't how much you had, but who you shared it with. Sweetness became the punctuation mark on an otherwise hard day. A reward. A bond. In some places, entire festivals revolved around sweet offerings. Honey fairs in medieval Europe. Fruit festivals in the Levant. Even funerals had their confection state-filled biscuits passed around after burial, reminding the living of life's brief sweetness. And always, children knew the signs. When the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and dried plum. When the good clay bowl came down from the shelf. When the beeswax candles were lit. They would watch, quietly hopeful, knowing something was coming not just for taste, but for feeling. Picture now a circle of women seated on wooden stools. One is shaping dough, with quiet focus. Another is humming. A third ladles hot fruit into small jars, passing them down the line to be sealed and wrapped. Outside, the wind rises. But inside, there is warmth. There is work. And there is sweetness. Because sharing sweetness, in these times, was an act of generosity, of celebration, of care. As you breathe in now, slow and soft, you may feel the weight of that shared moment, a spoon passed from hand to hand, a piece of honeyed bread torn in half, the laughter that follows when the jam is too thick or the cake slightly burned. These are the real flavors of history. Not perfect, but personal. Sweet, because they were shared. Let us walk now into a different kind of home, stone walls high, tapestries on the walls, servants bustling quietly in the shadows. The table here is longer, heavier. The plates are pewter, the bread is finer, and at the center, glistening beneath candlelight, sits a rare and shimmering jar of imported sweetness, because once upon a time, sweetness was more than taste, it was status. In a world where most people relied on fruit and honey, those with wealth had access to more ingredients, more tools, more time to refine what others could only gather. And so sweetness became a symbol of luxury, of class, of distance from hunger. To serve a dish that was sweet, especially one sweetened with something rare like imported sugar or exotic syrups from the East, was to speak without words. We can afford delight. In medieval Europe, sugar was once sold by the ounce, kept in locked boxes, prescribed more as a medicine than a food. Apothecaries handled it. Physicians recommended it for the heart, for melancholy, for strength of the brain. Its grainy crystals, when they appeared, were a marvel. Guests at noble feasts would whisper about them. A pinch in a sauce, a sprinkle on a pear. It was never used lightly. In some courts, sugar was shaped, sculpted, made into animals, coats of arms, even entire scenes. These subtleties, as they were called, were displayed between courses not just to be eaten, but to be admired. A castle made of sugar, a ship with sails, all to impress, to enchant, to remind guests where they sat, and who had set the table. But even outside the halls of power, sweetness carried meaning. A woman who could bake with honey every week was considered lucky or married to a good beekeeper. A family that could offer guests preserved plums in winter earned quiet admiration. Children with a fig tucked into their lunch bundle were envied. Clergy and scholars, too, sometimes enjoyed special access. Monasteries with large gardens might grow stevia-like herbs, or maintain their own hives. Monks brewed mead-fermented honey drink often reserved for feast days or visiting dignitaries, and when they opened their gates to the poor, a sweet biscuit might be offered along with soup, as a token of care. And yet, for all its ties to status, sweetness was never wholly owned by the elite. In every village, there were small rituals to reclaim it. The woman who made fruit paste and traded it for eggs, the grandfather who knew just when to tap the birch tree, the child who saved the last dried fig of summer to give his grandmother on her name day. These were quiet rebellions against scarcity, against hierarchy. A way to say, we may not have much, but we still have something sweet to give. Imagine now a feast in a great hall. Silver cups, roasted meats, and at the end, a sugar-coated almond, carefully wrapped in cloth and handed to each guest, not just as dessert but as proof. You were here. You were seen. You were given something rare. And then, somewhere else, a simpler moment. A woman in a cottage lifting the lid from a small jar. Inside, slices of pear in honey, saved all year. She spoons one into a wooden bowl, places it before a guest, and smiles. She, too, has given sweetness. And that, too, is power. So, as your breath slows and your body settles deeper into comfort, remember this. Sweetness was once a whisper of wealth, a taste of celebration, a symbol of love and effort. Whether served in marble halls or wooden huts, it carried the same message: you are worthy of joy. The door creaks open, and the cold rushes in. The guest stands at the threshold, cloaked and road-weary. In her hands, a basket of herbs. In her eyes, the quiet fatigue of travel. But inside, the fire is warm, the table is set, and waiting in the center is a small offering, a bowl of something sweet. Because in the old world, to welcome someone was to sweeten their arrival. Hospitality once lived in the smallest gestures, and among them, sweetness was the kindest. In many parts of the world, it was customary to offer a guest something sweet before anything else, even before water, a sign not only of welcome, but of peace. A way to say, here, you are safe. You are seen. You are home, even if only for a night. In Eastern Europe, it might be dried fruit soaked in warm wine, served with bread. In North Africa, a spoonful of date paste pressed with nuts. In the Mediterranean, preserved orange peel dusted with ground rose petals. No matter how simple the home, something sweet was saved for visitors. In northern villages, honey and cheese were often paired, offering richness and comfort in equal measure. In some places, a dried fig would be warmed by the hearth before serving. Not for flavor alone, but so the guest might hold something warm in their hands, a small comfort against cold fingers and long roads. Children were taught to serve these things with both hands, to not speak while placing the dish. To look into the eyes of the guest. It was a ritual, quiet and sincere. There were also special confections made only for company. In Ottoman kitchens, lokum, what we now call Turkish delight, was prepared in advance, dusted with starch, wrapped in cloth and hidden away until guests arrived. In Italy, confetti sugar-coated almonds are placed in small bowls. In Persia, candied rose, dattles. In China, dried persimmon slices offered with tea. Even in households where sugar was unknown, sweetness took other forms. A spoonful of honey stirred into hot milk. A handful of raisins passed in silence. A sliver of plum cake saved from the last feast day, reheated and shared. To offer sweetness was to offer dignity. Guests were rarely asked if they wanted something sweet. It was assumed they did. It wasn't about hunger. It was about trust. You had crossed their threshold, and they were placing something sacred into your hand. Something they had saved. Something that could not be replaced easily. And when guests left, sweetness followed them. A jar of preserves wrapped in linen. A few candied nuts tucked into a pocket. Sometimes, even a crust of sweetened bread, not meant to be eaten, but to be crumbled at the next doorstep as a blessing for safe travel. In some traditions, guests who received nothing sweet were thought to leave with a bitter heart. So, even the poorest homes, right. A bit of roasted grain. A spoonful of mead. A pressed apple slice dried to leather. Small, but enough. Picture now a winter night. A knock at the door. A grandmother rises from her chair, opens it, and smiles at the guest. No words yet. Just a nod, and then a bowl placed gently in their hands. Inside, a warm prune, soaked in honey, resting in milk. The guest exhales. Their shoulders drop. They are welcomed. As you rest now, with the quiet of that image wrapped around you, remember that sweetness was never just for flavor. It was for honor. For comfort. For the kindness of being seen. And long before sugar, long before candy, that kind of sweetness mattered most. The room is hushed now. Not with fear, but with reverence. The candle flickers in the corner. Outside, bells toll softly in the wind. And on the table near the window, someone places a small plationet, a piece of honeyed bread or a sugared date or a dried fruit gently pressed into shape. Sweetness, once again, has returned. But this time, it speaks not of welcome or celebration, but of farewell. In many older cultures, sweetness marked both ends of life. The beginning, yes, a drop of honey for the newborn, but also the end. A final taste. A gesture of remembrance. Death was once a quiet visitor, not a stranger. People passed in their homes, among family, near the hearth where they had baked and stirred and sung, and when they did, those who remained turned to ritual, to food, to sweetness. In Greece and Eastern Europe, kolava dish of boiled wheat, raisins, pomegranate seeds and honey was prepared for funerals. It was soft, fragrant, sweetened just enough to comfort. Each bite was meant to honor the soul of the departed, a reminder that life continued, even in sorrow. In the Middle East, dates were distributed at burials, both for the mourners and the poor. Sticky with natural sugars, they were believed to carry memory and to ease the spirit's journey. Sometimes they were stuffed with nuts, or pressed with spices, a small luxury at a time of grief. In Jewish tradition, after a burial, mourners often returned home to eat round food's eggs, lentils, and yes, sweet items too, honey cakes, stewed fruit. Foods without sharp edges, symbolizing the circle of life and the desire to bring gentle sweetness into sorrow. In some Christian villages, guests who came to sit with the grieving family were offered a slice of raisin bread or a fig tart, served in silence. The gesture said, "You are not alone. Even now, there is sweetness left." And for the dying themselves, it was common in many places to offer one final tasty spoonful of honey, if they could swallow. If not, a finger dipped and pressed gently to the lips, not as sustenance, but as blessing, as ease. Sweetness was also used in offerings to the dead. In parts of Asia, small cakes or fruits were left at graves. In medieval Europe, soul cakes were baked and distributed to the poor, each one eaten in the name of a departed soul, a way to ensure their safe passage and to comfort the living. One for the soul, they'd say, and hand over the sweet. Even the bees were told. In rural Britain and France, it was custom to whisper to the hives when someone died, to drape the skeps in black cloth, to offer a drop of honey at the entrance. for it was believed that bees shared the soul's journey, that they must be included in both joy and loss. And yet, sweetness never felt out of place at these moments. It softened the hard. It reminded the living that sweetness, like life, is brief but worth savouring. That even in parting, there is care. Imagine now a daughter lighting a candle. In her hands, a plate. On it, a single plum, dried and split open, filled with warm walnut paste and a drizzle of honey. She places it on the windowsill as dusk falls, her breath fogging the glass. This is not a grand meal. But it is sacred. It says, I remember. My honour. I offer. As your own breath slows now, and you drift into the gentler folds of thought, let that sweetness remain. Not loud, not bright, but deep. A sweetness that comforts, even when the world is quiet. Because in the end, when all other flavours fade, it is often the last sweetness that we remember most. And now, we come to a turning point. The world is changing. Ships are setting sail from distant coasts. Markets are growing crowded. In the air, the scent of cinnamon, cloves, and something new, something dazzling, white and strange. Granulated sugar has arrived. Not in every home, not yet. But it is coming, and it will change everything. For centuries, sugar was unknown to most of the world. It grew quietly in Southeast Asia, extracted from tall stalks of cane and boiled into sticky cakes. Traders brought small amounts westward, treasures fit for kings and apothecaries. But in time, with empire, conquest, and the rise of colonial plantations, sugar became more than a curiosity. It became a commodity, a power, a revolution in taste. At first, only these wealthy could afford it. Sugar was sold in Kanskul, sugar loaves and broken apart, with special tools. It was stored under lock and key, used sparingly in medicines, sauces, and the finest desserts. A single cube placed into tea was a luxury. A sweet glaze on pastry was a sign of status. But as more ships arrived from the Caribbean and Brazil, sugar became cheaper, more available. And with it came a change in habitone that would ripple across kitchens, customs, and lives. Honey was pushed aside. Where once honey had sweetened everything from porridge to medicines, now sugar took its place. It was easier to store, easier to measure. It dissolved cleanly. Bakers could depend on it. Cooks could standardize recipes. For the first time in history, sweetness became predictable. Old recipes were rewritten. New ones invented. Jams appeared. Iced cakes. Candies in bright wrappers. Chocolates filled with creams and syrups. The idea of dessert became formalized, separated from the meal, anticipated with joy. For ordinary people, this was thrilling. Sweetness, once rare and seasonal, could now be enjoyed often. A spoon of sugar in tea. A jar of preserves in winter. A birthday cake, even for a child in a modest home. But with abundance came forgetting. The quiet arts, the drying of apples, the boiling of must, the steeping of petals began to fade. The patience required to coax sweetness from roots or bark became less common. Generations who had once waited all year for a honeyed plum now reached daily for the sugar jar. And still, something of the old ways remained. In country kitchens, grandmothers kept jars of dried fruit on shelves, even if sugar sat beside them. In small towns, honey was still prized in tea or drizzled over cheese. In spring, children still picked violets to candy. The memory of sweetness before sugar never fully disappeared. It softened, like the aftertaste of a well-made jam. And in recent years, many have looked back, remembered, wondered, what did sweetness used to mean? Because sugar, for all its brightness, is simple, uniform. It lacks the whispering complexity of a dried apricot soaked in wine, the deep patience of a root tea, the joy of finding the last fig of the season and splitting it with someone you love. So now, as the room grows dim and the day drifts toward its final hush, you may ask yourself, what is the sweetest thing you remember? Was it a flavor? Or was it a moment? A time when sweetness was earned. When it was shared. when it said something more than just good taste, when it meant care, attention, time, ritual. Let yourself rest in that thought, because even now, when sugar is everywhere, the truest sweetness is still rare, still chosen, still remembered.